So I'm Ken Jacobs, the chair of the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and want to welcome everybody onto the webinar today to talk about local strategies for protecting public jobs during the COVID-19 crisis. This is one of a series of webinars and resources that the Labor Center has put together during this crisis. And I will put in the chat or the link to our website so you can see the various resources that we've been putting together on this. And we'll be releasing a report soon in the coming weeks looking at occupations in California and their relative risk related to COVID spread, and looking at the demographics of the workers in those various occupations. We look forward to sharing more resources with you in the coming period. And just to say, it's really great to have so many people join us today for this conversation, and to be in a conversation with people who are folks who are on the front lines of really fighting to save public services in California during this crisis. And so again, thanks for joining us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Hinckley.
Great, thank you. So I'll introduce our three panelists first, and then I'm going to say a few words about the situation that we find ourselves in, and then hand it off to Caitlin and Kristen to get us started. So with us today, we have Bob Brownstein, a strategic advisor for Working Partnerships USA, labor community organization in the South Bay, Caitlin Prendeville, research director of SCIU 10-1, and Kristen Schumacher, who's a research specialist with IFPTE 21. So really grateful to have you all here, hoping that you can leave us inspired for how we can keep local government from spiraling over the next couple of years. So we're excited to hear about what you've been working on. So I wanted to just give us a little bit of context about where we are. We have been, let me get this is my fourth Zoom presentation of the day. So the fatigue is setting in, but I'm gonna hope that I get this slideshow through. So in the last 6 months since the shelter-in-place orders began, California and the United States have seen huge job losses. And what I want to just draw our attention to is the fact that we've been hearing about some economic recovery, some people returning to work, but we are not seeing that in the local government sector. And from February to July, we saw a loss of 160,000 local government workers just in California. And 33,000 state workers. And we've seen modest increases in state government workers being hired back over the past month or two, but we're now approaching a local government job loss share that is almost on pace with the overall private sector job loss. And we're not seeing that recovery happen at the same pace as the private sector. So month over month in California, we have seen the private sector begin to hire people back as businesses are opened up, but we're beginning to see the fiscal implications take hold in local government. So again, very modest recovery in June of employees in local government and state government, but we don't yet have data on the budget year that we're all in the middle of and that we're going to be hearing more about today, which is the fiscal year that started in July 2020. So we can see from just over the last year and a half, since a year before this pandemic began to affect us, that the private sector has begun to recover, state government has begun to recover modestly, but the local government sector is well below the levels that it was at a year and a half ago. And the reason that we're all of us on this panel and around the state are so concerned about this is because of what we saw happen after the last recession. So from December 2007, when the official start of the Great Recession, we saw again a significant dip in private sector employment that then began to recover when the recession itself officially ended. So at the end of 2009, you see this red line begin to come back up in the private sector. We saw a spike in federal government employment with the census and the stimulus package, and then somewhat stable federal government employment over the following decade. But local government employment compared to population growth never recovered from the last recession. And now we see it falling again far below state and federal employment. And part of this is that state and federal governments are able to push down their own shortfalls onto local government. So that's where we are at this moment. And we're going to spend today hearing about what local government strategies are possible and have been tried specifically here in California. So without further ado, I will hand it off. I'm not sure who's starting, Caitlin or Kristen, but.
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay, Kristen. First of all, thanks, Sarah and Ken, for having us. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I would say, from a research perspective, it's really important that we conduct, a thorough budget analysis when we're at the table or we're being pressured to take concessions from our employers, which is happening across our jurisdiction. But, before the pandemic, we'd often hear from them at the bargaining table about budget deficits. They don't have any money. There's a structural budget deficit. They're broke. But when we compare the budget projections to the actual numbers in the CAFRs, we often see a very different picture. And in San Francisco, for example, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in the difference between their projections and their actual numbers. Over the past 10 years, they've projected massive budget deficits, but ended each fiscal year with a surplus to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're dealing with this kind of trickery now in a really intensified way, but we've been successful in pushing back on concessions in places like the city of Napa, city of Oakland, city and county of San Francisco, in part by showing, that the employer not only has money in reserves, but we can identify unassigned fund balances and other extra pots of money, that the city or county is kind of intentionally obscuring from us and from the public. And so we bring that information to electeds on the council or on the board of soups. And obviously that's not enough, facts aren't going to win the day. This is ultimately about power, but I think, the research piece is a key part of the overall campaign to push back against austerity. And I would also say, in spite of the very real fiscal challenges ahead, we're in a different environment, fortunately, than we were in the post-2008 recession. I think this pandemic and the climate disasters we're seeing have really laid bare consequences, the consequences of decades of austerity and underfunding of the public sector. And I think more people are realizing we need to invest in stronger local government infrastructure, and that when we divest from public services during a recession, that only slows the overall economic recovery. We've also learned from past mistakes. Employers will try to exploit this crisis and extract concessions from us immediately, often under the guise of avoiding layoffs, but then they implement layoffs regardless, and that sets us back even further. And many of our employers have also learned from the past, and they've built up significant reserves and rainy day funds, but now, of course, are hesitant to use them. And one of the reasons that they're worried about, that some of our employers have said is that, they're worried it's going to impact their credit ratings, which is a pretty absurd argument to make. There's actually a lot of helpful resources from the Pew Research Center on this question. Even the ratings agencies themselves have said that state and local governments actually should be drawing down reserves. If this isn't a rainy day, I don't know what constitutes one. And we're also in a completely different credit market today than we were in the post-2008 recession. And lastly, I think the movement to defund the police and the fact that it's gaining ground nationally and locally is really exciting. And I think it's an opportunity for us to work with our community allies on reducing police spending. Because as we've all known for a long time, police departments often take up, up to 50% or more of general fund dollars. And it's often at the expense of important services that our members provide, like public health, social work, working in libraries, public works, and more. So I think it's important that we, support this wider reckoning on how we actually prioritize spending public dollars and what services we should be investing in. And here in Oakland, we support, a task force that 2 council members set up to reduce general fund spending to the police department by 50%. Yeah, and obviously the revenue piece is also critical. And I know Kristen is going to talk about that. So I'll hand it over to her.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. So I'm going to talk about 2 of the revenue campaigns that we have going on right now that both Local 21 and SEIU 10-1 have been working on in the city of Richmond and in Oakland. In the spirit of reflection and learning from our mistakes, like Caitlin mentioned, as researchers, we did we went back and looked at what happened after 2008 and tried to think critically about what we could do better. And one of the things that we really noticed in terms of revenue was that the general fund revenue measures that did happen across the Bay were often too little or too late to really capture the growth in the economy that was happening across the Bay and translate that into improved investment in public services. And frankly, we were not passing revenue measures that could really meet the community's needs over the course of the recovery. And so I'm going to talk about cities mostly because that's where we have some of the more ambitious revenue measures happening. But we did a deep dive into city budgets to try to figure out what are the major revenue sources that we actually can, to some extent, control on the local level. Obviously, property taxes are a big source of revenue for all local government, but that's something that is controlled by the constraints of Prop 13 right now. And obviously, I think we're probably all hoping that Prop 15 will pass and that there will be that will finally close the loophole in our property tax system. But what we sort of landed on was looking at cities' business taxes. One of the better examples that was out there of revenue measures done right were the multiple reforms to San Francisco's business tax that happened over the course of the recovery period. And they have a system right now that is a progressive gross receipts tax. So it's a tax based on how much revenue a business has, and it has marginal progressive rates, much like our income tax system, where a small business is paying a lower rate on their first $1 million in revenue than a big business would pay on their $50 millionth in revenue. And while they had passed a number of these reforms, other cities throughout the region are still living with business taxes that in some cases were put in place decades ago and have not changed since. So Oakland, for example, they have a gross receipts tax system, but it's not progressive. It's not progressively structured. And what that means is, for example, like a small mom and pop laundry business in Oakland is actually paying more in local business taxes than the same business would pay in San Francisco right now. And then the flip side of that is that a huge corporation like Clorox, which is actively profiting from the pandemic right now, is effectively getting a tax break by being in Oakland instead of being across the Bay in San Francisco. And then you look at a city like Richmond, their business tax is really very minimal. Most businesses are paying about $238 in an annual renewal fee, and that's pretty much it for a lot of businesses. And of course, Richmond is the industrial base of Contra Costa County. It's where most of the largest employers in the county are. And you have Chevron, which has a refinery that is almost 3,000 acres. So of course they use a lot of the city's infrastructure, but they're paying comparatively little in their local business tax. They pay about $100,000. And then all of the businesses that are suppliers to Chevron as well. Like for example, Sims Metals is a supplier that had a huge fire that cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars in resources, but they pay about $1,400 each year in local business tax. So in terms of what we can do to actually make these systems more equitable and move measures in these cities, in both cases, we started with building coalitions of community groups, other labor unions, environmental groups, to talk about what the needs are in the community and how we could move a measure, craft a measure. Frankly, because these are big, cumbersome measures. These are not simple. And also the revenue potential is a lot more than what we typically deal with on local revenue measures. Just for context, in Oakland, the revenue that could come from this type of reform is more than every single general fund revenue measure that passed since 2009 combined. So the potential for a fight from the Chamber of Commerce is also pretty large. So we had to start with building a groundwork for a campaign first to have these conversations and to talk about how these systems are not equitable. We looked at best practices for business taxes around the region. Business taxes are different in every single city, so there are plenty of examples to look at. And then finally, a big part of this was outreach to small businesses to talk about what their needs are. And a lot of small businesses don't realize that in these cities, they are actually shouldering most of the tax burden compared to these large corporations. And often small businesses don't really think a lot about their business tax. Usually they're paying a couple $100. It's kind of the cost of doing business in their minds. But what we found is that a lot of small businesses are really feeling the lack of services. And it's important to have that conversation about how austerity has been impacting them, and then talking about who is paying in the community and how that could be done better. So right now where we're at is that in Richmond, Measure U is on the ballot for this year. And then in Oakland, they're actually laying the groundwork to take a reform measure to the ballot in 2022. And later this year or early next year, we'll be putting together a commission of labor and community and business groups to start crafting that measure and make a recommendation on reforming the business tax. So I think that's all I have.
That's great. Thank you so much. So Bob, if you could talk a little bit about the sort of policy context in which we're having these conversations, and maybe how it compares to the climate that existed in the last recession too.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. What I'd like to do is break my conversation into two pieces. One, existing resources, and the second one is new revenues. And for existing resources, I'm just going to go over the checklist of things that were relevant in the last recession are relevant now, in terms of these are all things that people should pay attention to in terms of trying to squeeze out every last buck that you can. And some of them are ones that Caitlin already mentioned, but I'll go over them because it's a checklist to make sure that we go over all of them. So one is the accuracy of projections. Budgets are estimates, they're not real numbers. And you can either look at the history of your jurisdiction or compare it to other jurisdictions, but there's ways you can see whether your jurisdiction is dramatically lowballing its estimates of revenues or dramatically overestimating expenditures, and they tend to do both. And to the extent you can get those corrected, it's just like finding money. Second, fund balances. Fund balances are money that's left over in some specific fund, and the question is, can you get access to the money? So in some cases it's restricted, but the language is loose enough so you can find a way to use it for something that you need. In some cases the language is so loose that you can actually transfer the money into the general fund. And even if you can't use it or transfer it, you can borrow it as long as you pay interest, and interest rates are very, very low now. So you may be asked, if you want to borrow it, how are you going to pay it back? So you can generically say, well, the economy is going to get better, and if Prop 15 passes from my lips to God's ear, then you'll absolutely be able to say how it can be paid back. Reserves, you want to make sure that you get the jurisdiction to fess up and show what all the reserves are that it has. And then you can compare how relevant those reserves are to reality by looking at history and seeing whether they've ever come near to spending the level of reserves that they're squirreling away. With this particular recession, it's a good time to look at encumbrances. Encumbrances are things that were started in the previous fiscal year, weren't finished, and are being carried over to this fiscal year. But times have changed dramatically, and what looked like a priority in good times may not be a priority in bad times, and you may be able to squeeze money out of the encumbrance line item. Contract services and consultants, the first challenge is to find out what all of them are. And the second challenge is to try and get the jurisdiction to reduce those categories. In the last recession, I saw jurisdictions simply contact all their vendors and say, we're in trouble, and even though you have a contract, we want you to reduce your cost to us by 10%. And a surprisingly number of outfits that didn't want to lose the government as a customer said, okay, we're cutting 10% off the bill. You also want to make sure that you have access to the revenue that's there. And one aspect of that is to make sure the government doesn't say, well, it's one-time revenue, so you can't use it for ongoing expenditures like staff. At this point, I think probably the easiest thing to, not necessarily easiest, but the simplest thing to do is say, look, there should be some percentage of the one-time revenues that happen, and one-time revenues happen every year. They're just different one-times. There's some percentage that should be considered ongoing revenue. So if every year you have somewhere between 20 and $40 million of one-time revenue, say you should always consider 10 million as ongoing. So at least you won't have to have the fight over that 10 million. Also, be careful of reserve policies that take money that are desperately needed for services and squirrel them away in reserves that are ridiculous. The city of San Jose right now is actually considering one of the dumbest proposals I've seen during this pandemic, and that is a proposal that says 50% of any surpluses should automatically be put into a reserve instead of used to deal with the Herculean demands for services that are existing there. So that's sort of the list. And people should check off every one. And if there's any questions on them, please ask when we get to the Q&A. Now, new revenues. I'm going to talk primarily about changing the system because the system is designed to make it very hard to get new revenues. So what can we do to try and make it easier? And we're looking now a couple of years into the future. Well, there is a San Francisco Measure C decision that just got the higher court failed to overturn the lower court decision that affirmed Measure C. That means you can put a tax on the ballot for a specific purpose. If it's done through the initiative process, you only need a 50% vote. People should absolutely be trying to think of what they can do in the spring of 2022 to take advantage of Measure C. We should also be very prepared for a statewide initiative by the Jarvis folks to try and overturn that legal decision. Counties are particularly vulnerable in terms of the existing system. There aren't many taxes they have the authority to levy, but that can be changed by state statute. So a state statute could finally allow counties to raise business taxes and utility taxes outside the unincorporated areas, allow them to raise sin taxes, tobacco, alcohol, and sugar sweetened beverage taxes, to do real estate transfer taxes outside the unincorporated areas. A simple statutory change there would really give counties a tremendous increase in their ability to raise revenue, assuming they can get majority support from the electorate. The sales tax, which numerous jurisdictions rely on, is an increasingly inadequate tax because the base of the sales tax in California is only tangible products, and the share of the economy that's tangible products goes down every single year. A state statute could expand the base of the sales tax to include services, not necessarily all services, but some services. A state statute could eliminate the uniformity principle for counties and school districts for parcel taxes. Charter cities don't have this problem, but cities and counties and school districts, if they charge a single family home $10 per parcel for parcel tax, they have to charge their biggest commercial industrial property owner $10. They can't have a variation. If you can have a variation, which you can do now in charter cities, and ideally with a statutory change you could do in counties and school districts, you can tailor a parcel tax so that 99% of the revenue comes from the biggest businesses in your jurisdiction, and residential property pays either nothing or very, very little. And in any presentation on changing the system, you always want to have one Hail Mary proposal. So today's Hail Mary proposal, from my perspective, is to overturn Proposition 26. Proposition 26 is a measure that dramatically restricts the ability of governments to impose fees. It says that virtually everything except a very plain vanilla regulatory tax or development tax, development fee is a tax. But if you could overturn Prop 26, then legislatively you could say businesses that sell sugar-sweetened beverages can have fees imposed on them because of the extent of obesity in the community. Slumlords could have fees imposed on them because of crime in the area. Polluters could have fees put on them because of the health effects of pollution. And you could do all that legislatively without going to the ballot. So one day, maybe we'll be able to overturn Proposition 26, maybe soon, and then all those legislative possibilities would emerge. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So I have one question for all three of you before we ask questions from the chat, which is, does it seem like this is a different climate in which to try to push for local taxes, particularly on businesses, using some of the strategies all three of you described? Because I've seen the list of local ballot initiatives in November, and there's not yet a sort of tide of business taxes, with the exception of cannabis taxes on the ballot, and Richmond's example. Does this feel like, given enough time to sort of do the groundwork to build those coalitions, that we're at a moment where we could push for more of those? Or does it seem like the pandemic shelter-in-place business closure situation has perhaps engendered more sympathy for small businesses in particular? And how do you, what's been your experience sort of pushing this conversation forward?
I can definitely start by talking about what we've experienced with the measures in Richmond and Oakland. Since these are progressively structured taxes that are giving tax breaks to small businesses while shifting the tax burden to large businesses, and it's based on revenue. So if a business is not making money, their tax liability is not going to go up. I think that's something that we've found that there's a real desire for in the community. And both of those measures polled very, very well. The struggle is that it also, we are in a situation where there is also maybe going to be a bigger fight and more opposition from the business community right now. I mean, there would be a fight regardless, but there's a lot of fear mongering that can be done with elected officials, you know, saying that, you know, we're gonna leave your district, we're gonna leave the city, you know, now that there's remote work, we can go basically anywhere for some of these companies. So there's pluses and minuses to this situation, but if you can get them on the ballot, what we've been finding is that voters really feel the inequality and the lack of services and the consequences of austerity and want a structure that's more fair.
I'd just make a comment, because I've been now going to many, many debates and trying to get endorsements for Prop 15, and the issue, I mean, what you're basically arguing about is who's getting taxed when you're talking about commercial, industrial, and taxation. And it's clear that people draw a big distinction between big profitable guys who may not have been paying their share in the past and small guys who are desperately struggling to survive. So you have to structure your proposal so that it's as clear as possible that the small struggling guys are not going to get hit, and that the big guys who are doing real well, even though there's a pandemic and maybe haven't been paying as much as they should have in the past, are the ones who are going to be paying the overwhelming amount of the tax. It's also, I mean, it's not the reason why we did it in Prop 15, but it's been useful in Prop 15 debates to point out that the revenue isn't starting tomorrow. That, you know, Prop 15 revenues aren't going to be imposed, or taxes aren't going to be imposed for 2 years or so, because you have to go through the process of reassessing properties. People do like the idea of some kind of grace period. Now, I mean, you know, money's needed right away, but if you could pass something into something of a grace period, there's also the option of borrowing from internal funds and paying back because you've just passed the tax and you know money's going to be coming in. It's not going to be coming in tomorrow. It's going to be coming in 18 months or whatever the dates are that you put into the revenue measure.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what both Kristen and Bob already said, which is like during a pandemic, before a pandemic, after, I mean, we're going to be in hand-to-hand combat with the Chamber of Commerce, regardless on any kind of progressive revenue measure. But I think, you know, this is anecdotal, but I also have spent a lot of time talking about schools and communities first, and I, you know, helped get it onto the ballot, collecting signatures, and people understand, right? Like Bob said, the distinction. It's just, it's about, you know, it's on us to do that political education first with our members, and then, you know, with the wider public.
Great, thanks. So one of the questions from Local 221 in San Diego is, so one of the things that can be easier for local governments to pass are different types of fees, because there's not necessarily the requirement to take it to voters. But we often think of them as being somewhat regressive. So is it possible to use something, for example, like an occupational license fee with a more progressive income-based structure, if local governments want to explore those ways of raising revenues?
I don't see why you couldn't put a progressive structure on it. I mean, an occupational license fee is really a business license fee, and you can pretty much structure that any way you want to. I mean, the only risk would be an equal protection challenge, and frankly, the high courts don't care about equal protection challenges unless they're based on a protected class, and we're not talking about anything that would challenge a protected class. So, yeah, you know, you ought to be able to do that. Now, when you're talking about other kinds of fees, like regulatory fees or user fees, then there are cost recovery limitations that are imposed, and you know, you can't make money on them. You can, you're limited.
Great. And then another question, so going back to sort of the state need for policy change and Measure C, the finding in Measure C, or the holding, what does that mean for the child care measure in City of Oakland in particular, and also in Alameda County? So how is this going to affect measures that just missed that threshold the last time? I think that's what they're asking.
Or in this case, they were over the majority under the 2/3. Right?
Right. So they make the newly approved threshold, but they were initially declared defeated. So I don't know the answer to whether that affects those particular measures. I don't know if anybody here does, but. So I have another question about how this compares to previous recessions, specifically around reserves and the jurisdictions that you've been working in. One of the things that helped California, you know, not have to implement the same level of cuts that we have before is the building of a healthy reserve in between these two recessions. Which also came at some cost of not being able to spend that money on other things, obviously. But are local governments also in a situation where they have better reserves than they did last time? And how do you sort of frame this argument around, yes, it's necessary to spend this money during a rainy day, but is that also develop some additional, you know, resistance against spending reserves, or pushes from the employers that building reserves is an ongoing need? And has that dynamic been different from the way it played out in the last recession?
Well, it's still ongoing, so I'm not sure you can say that it's different from the last recession, but you do amazingly run into jurisdictions that put money away into reserve so that they'll have it available in a crisis. And then when a crisis happens, they don't want to spend their reserves. they say, you know, we don't want to be left without reserves. And it's, I mean, part of it, I guess, is the bond ratings, but I think it's also, they sort of view having reserves as a security blanket and as an evidence of fiscal responsibility. And it's a real challenge to get people to spend the reserves for the specific purpose that they squirreled the money away for in the first place. I think the only way to do it is to hammer these jurisdictions on the specific things that need the money. We need the money to be spent on, and you know, build coalitions that are going to be basically of people who basically saying, "I spent my reserves. My family's hurting. You know, you spend your reserves."
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely been, I mean, I mentioned earlier too, I mean, the issue around the credit ratings argument, but in general, yes, the employers have been pretty resistant to use their reserves. And by employers, I mean, usually the finance staff, right? Or the finance director, not necessarily the board or the council. But, you know, one of our cities basically said across the table when we kind of exhausted this argument with them that they were like, well, what if there could be an earthquake later this year? Like what, and it's like, this is basically an earthquake that's happening right now. And so you really should be drawing down more of the reserves, but it's, you know, yeah, it's a fight that we have with them. And I think Bob's right. I think there's some kind of psychological part to it too, where they don't want to let it go and they're afraid to really use it, but it's pretty absurd because that's why they built them up. And I think it varies, but in general, most of our employers have built up better reserves because of the post-2008 crash, right? And precisely for this reason, and now we're in this bizarre fight with a lot of them. So.
One finance director from a city in the East Bay actually told me they needed to have 20% of their general fund in reserve in case a hurricane hit the Bay Area. I'm not making this up.
Well, if that happens, we're all leaving, so.
And I'll just add, you know, our experience was that a lot of agencies had even exceeded their own reserve policies. And that was relatively common. And also that a number of agencies had created over the recovery period, a number of different reserve funds. So part of the conversation was identifying, and I think Bob mentioned this earlier, identifying all of the reserve funds that are out there. What is the balance in all of the reserve funds? And so far, our experience has been that in some agencies, people feel more comfortable using certain reserve funds first. And we've had more luck with that, or, you know, like really pushing a message that like, we're going to find a number of strategies, one of which is using some portion of reserves. And we've had some success with that as well.
So I have a question too about most of the strategies we're talking about are relating to funding, obviously ongoing operating and staff expenditures. But one of the things that I learned recently, you know, so we all know the state bond measure failed on the ballot in March for the state to be able to borrow money to spend on school and other infrastructure. And in looking back at the fate of local bond measures, even school bond measures, which are usually pretty well supported, it seems like voters are sort of less and less supportive of those measures. And one of the most sort of damaging ways that local government can retreat is to stop spending money on infrastructure. And some aspects of debt are very different now than they were after the Great Recession. As Bob said, interest rates are very low. The capital markets have not collapsed in the way that they did last time. So how are you thinking, or what are you sort of hearing from jurisdictions about their willingness to continue to seek voter approval for financing to keep infrastructure going? Because that's another way that we keep people employed, right, and keep the economy going, and want to make sure that we're not preventing that from happening as we seek this sort of economic recovery.
Well, it's mixed. I mean, the Bay Area jurisdictions did put a tax on the ballot for Caltrain, which is infrastructure. I mean, it's a regressive tax. It's a sales tax, and Caltrain is used by the most affluent commuters in the Bay Area. But it is an infrastructure investment.
Have either Caitlin or Kristen spent time talking with employers or engaging with them about either using debt to, as Bob said, you know, borrowing against funds in order to cover expenses, or continuing to pursue projects, infrastructure projects, you know, or is there sort of a retreat from doing that? Or is this not yet what our local government's still sort of mired in, just how we're going to keep people employed this year and not yet thinking about that infrastructure picture?
My experience so far has been that on the question of just borrowing money in the near term, that's something that we also have a lot of very emotional reaction to from employers. And I don't, you know, I think that might be just sort of trauma from the experience of 2008. And as far as like future bond measures go, I don't think that's a conversation that we've really seen happen. But I will say part of our experience, and I deal a lot with Oakland, and Oakland passed a pretty significant bond measure, KK, a few years ago. And one of the conversations we had been having over the past few years is that this measure passed, the funding was there for certain types of infrastructure projects, but the city struggled to hire staff to actually complete the infrastructure projects, and understaffing in some of these positions that are funded through other revenue streams was so severe that they actually had trouble using the money that voters approved. And so I think it's a more, you know, we had to have a more nuanced conversation about that, because the city needed more revenue sources to support long-term staffing needs in order to actually get these paving projects done, to get these affordable housing projects done, and things like that. You know, especially with housing projects, which is so critical right now, they were having trouble getting some of that out the door because a quarter of the budgeted positions in their housing department were vacant because they could not hire staff because of holding down wages over the course of the recovery.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, in terms of recently and since the pandemic started, I'm not aware of any conversations around future bond measures with employers at this point. But I think, like you said, Sarah, it's probably, I think everyone is in kind of crisis management right now and trying to figure out what next year is going to look like.
So another question from the chat. So as I mentioned and have talked with some of you about, both the federal and state government recovery was stronger than local government overall. Although in California, if you remove education from state employment, so if you take higher ed out, basically, the rest of state government employment recovered much worse. A lot of the state recovery was fueled by employment at UCs and CSUs and the sort of associated infrastructure with that. So the question is, how do we get more state and federal resources down to the local governments this time around? So this is obviously a huge question. Many of us would love to know how we could get the federal government to do anything except shut down over the next 14 days. But I am interested in your thoughts on that question in general, sort of what are the prospects for both state and federal aid for local governments, but also how local governments and employers are talking about some of the federal programs that have existed, in both the CARES Act funding, but also, you know, the municipal lending support or other programs to sort of channel some of that state and federal money down to local employers.
Well, I'd say, I mean, I think if, again, from my lips to God's ear, if the Democrats take everything in November, we'll get some resources targeted towards local government out of the federal government. I think our congressional delegation will be responsive on that. The challenge is actually the state. And I think there we have to try and find sort of broad coalitions that include local government and other players. So like, if we can put together broad coalitions that say the Medi-Cal rates should go up in California instead of being cut, and it's not just counties that want that, there's a lot of players that want that. If we accomplish that, it brings substantial amounts of money down to local government. And I think we need to come up with things like that. Just having local government make its case, it's kind of like a root canal work when you go to Sacramento and try and do that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is, obviously we have a limited amount of control over what the state and federal government do, but I think a lot of us also know in our local jurisdictions who the elected officials are and who the people are that really, go to Sacramento often and really care about lobbying these higher levels of government. And making sure that we understand these things ourselves and are communicating that when we talk to these elected officials, I think is important. As we're also talking about city and county budgets as well.
Great. Oh, sorry, Caitlin, did you want to?
Oh no,
add to that?
I don't have much to add, but I think just like Kristen had talked about in her piece earlier, and with the Supreme Court case. I think that the opportunities now have increased to raise revenue at the local level, and I think it's also important that we start shifting kind of our strategy to really focus on that, since, like Bob said, it's difficult to get something out of the state, and there are a lot of statutory changes that need to happen. So that's all.
So I just have a follow-up, I guess, about the state dynamic. So Governor Newsom endorsed Prop 15, and then said, yay, which is great news, but he made some statements about, we need to stop taxing the rich, or, we're not, sort of some ambiguous statements about what other kinds of tax measures he might support. So thinking ahead over the next, I guess, year or year and a half, even though none of us know what's going to happen in November, I guess, what are your sort of thoughts about how a local strategy and also building, like you said, Kristen, those local coalitions to push for some changes at the state level? But what does that sort of agenda look like, and who do you see as the coalition partners in that? What are the other sort of motivations for non-labor partners to think about whether to push for new revenues at the state level, or push for changes at the state level, or work at the local level? How do you see that evolving over the next year and a half? After we pass Prop 15.
I think there's just enormous possibilities for building coalitions right now, because everyone needs public services, and everyone is really feeling the lack of public services and where it has, the moment that we're in right now and how that was created by austerity. Definitely the coalitions that we've been building are often, at least on just speaking about the local level, it's a lot of the groups who have been paying attention to the budget process at these agencies for a while, often because they're trying to get, something that is like a Band-Aid to a bigger systemic problem. And I think now is a really big opportunity to talk about how we actually change the system, and how where there are shared points of potential solidarity between labor and community. Because the reality is, you might need a housing program to protect tenants, but it's not going to be very successful if there's no staff in the program at the city. And so we really do have some shared demands there. And it's, some of the opportunities that Bob brought up about things that could be done to create more possibility on the local level, I think are really interesting. I know it's really, it is really frustrating how limited counties are in the potential for progressive tax measures. And it would really be interesting to see what we could do with that. And, I think the groundwork that we've laid in some of these cities, there's a lot of potential to have a deeper conversation. Also because of what Caitlin brought up earlier, which is that we have an unprecedented amount of people paying attention to local government budgets because of the question around policing and what our priorities are. And why do we always cut housing departments and public health, and yet sheriff's departments and police departments almost never get cut. So I think that's also a very real opportunity that's new and very different from what we've seen in the past.
The only comment I would make is, if we're going to try and work, if we want to just try and figure out what we really think we need and try and put it on the ballot and pass it, that's one strategy. But if the strategy is to try and deal with the legislature and deal with the governor, then the goal is to build a strong enough coalition and a careful enough set of objectives so that people who don't really want to give us what we want feel that they have to negotiate with us. Because if they don't, then there's a real risk that we're going to shove it down their throats. So, what is that? We got to do a lot of polling. We got to do a lot of coalition building, et cetera. I don't have a crystal ball. But I think that, those are the sort of, and they're related. Those are sort of the fundamental options. One is to just, go for the ballot, and the other is to try and get something through the legislative process with the threat of going to the ballot as something that helps people feel decide that they have to do business with us. And that may not get us enough. Certainly won't get us everything we want if we do that strategy, but we should walk away with something. We shouldn't get closed out if we do that kind of effort.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what both Bob and Kristen said, I think this crisis has really laid bare the consequences of decades of austerity in this country and in this state. And I think more people are aware of that. I also think it's a ripe environment for continuing to strengthen those relationships that we have with our community allies for that reason and because of the movement to defund the police. And I think, again, we're in a different environment for many reasons, but one of the positive reasons is that, public sector workers aren't being demonized and vilified in the way that we saw post 2008, oh, it's the pensions, oh, it's this and that. They are the reason that we're in this kind of crisis. That's not happening. Our members are getting, applauded on the street for being heroes, and, people are bringing, hot meals to our nurse members at Highland Hospital. I think, again, the pandemic has laid bare, really what people realize needs to be a priority in terms of how we invest, in our services. And I think that hopefully that bodes well for the future in terms of coalition building between labor and community.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that we're ending on a more optimistic note. It is very interesting that the conversations, not just around public employees, but also the sort of irresponsibility of local governments and their borrowing, which really drove a lot of the narrative in 2009 and later, is just absent. And I do think it's people recognizing both that the local government, which voters have always trusted more than state or federal government, people have always felt closer to their local representatives and felt had more positive feelings about local government. And I think the attention focused on it now is so critical as we have this, complete abdication of governance at the federal level, and the clear need for functioning infrastructure to protect people and keep them healthy, does create this great sense of possibility. I think one interesting conversation I've heard around the defund the police and what it can help us do is that it also makes it clear that it's very difficult for people, even if they love their governments, to understand what's in the budget, and that department-based budgeting in particular and fund-based budgeting are very opaque to people, and that part of what we might be able to work on in these coalitions is this sort of shifting the way we think about budgets to activities and people, and really understanding, helping people to understand the work that's being done, and to be able to identify the activities that they really value, and the activities that they would like to see less resources going to. So this is a really exciting moment in that regard. Odd thing to say in the middle of our semi-apocalypse, but I really appreciate all of these examples and thoughts about what we can focus on at the local level, and we'll all cross our fingers, but not just cross our fingers, but work to sort of move our conversation forward about fiscal strategies to prevent this a drag that will drag on the recovery going forward.
Sarah, I do want to correct one comment I made earlier. As we've been talking, I've been thinking about that question about occupational license fees. I actually think that's a regulatory fee. And I have to look at it some more, but if it is a regulatory fee, then it's capped at 100% cost recovery. So you could make it progressive in the sense of giving some businesses a break, but you wouldn't be able to get over 100% cost recovery and turn it into a revenue generator.
So looking at the time here, want to thank everybody again for joining us today, and really thank Sarah for the work you did pulling this together, Caitlin, Kristen, and Bob for your great and really helpful presentations, and Sissy Wood from SEIU State Council for her encouraging us and pushing us to do these kinds of webinars and bring these resources to folks. We've heard a lot today about how important our public services are, especially now as we're in this pandemic, and the dangers of austerity in terms of the effects on the economy. We've heard about strategies to do research to find revenues in local government, or find funds that exist within local government, and not just to take a word of the city manager, whoever the budget folks in terms of what's there, of strategies to raise revenue, ideas around what can be done at the state level to make it easier for local governments to raise revenue. And through all of it, the importance and necessity of building the strong coalitions and member engagement that will make it possible to have the power to actually win these changes. So thanks again for coming, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. And please look to our website, join us for future webinars and trainings and activities. And again, thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.